Hello everybody, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and I have another tutorial for you today, continuing on the theme of dynamics. Now this question actually originated from somebody during the Rocket Lasso live stream. I get a lot of my inspiration from there. People ask really cool questions, and sometimes I think something that might be straightforward or something that a lot of people might already know ends up being really interesting. So this is an example of that. Now, make sure you come and join us during those live streams at some point every Wednesday at 2 o'clock Central Time. And I think it's 7 p.m. GMT, depending on what time of the year it is. We got daylight savings, which is always a little bit of a pain. And then make sure that you check out the archives on the new Rocket Lasso Live archive channel on YouTube. I'll put a link for that somewhere around here, definitely below. But let's get going. Here we are in Cinema 4D S22. Although everything we're working with should work in R19 and beyond, except for some of these nice viewport features. As you'll see, I've got a little bit of stuff set up just to make it look nicer. I've got a floor, a sky, an HDR materials already applied to it. There's a light with a hard shadow. It's infinite and aiming down, so we can make things look nice. And some materials already built. They're pretty straightforward. It's just a reflectance workflow, so I'm using reflectance for the color, and then some bump channels with Cinema 4D noises inside. Let's make it look a little bit better though by changing some of our display settings. But to do that, we should probably put our basic tree trunk in here. I'm going to leave it pretty default. We'll leave the radius of 50 and let's change the height to 2000. I want to sit directly on the ground, so I'll move it up exactly 1000 units and it should be sitting right there. We got a pretty good scale. Drop the bark on the tree, even renaming that to tree. It seems like a good idea. And with that set up, changing a couple of viewport options should help us out here. I want high quality noises, which is really neat. Watch how the tree changes, and do you see all these seam lines that we're getting? Changing that to high quality noises will make that seamless, and the tree is going to look a lot better as well. It's going to look a lot more the way that the final will look. Then I can turn on some SSAO to get some contact shadows, and then regular shadows because I've got this light set up with a hard, a ray traced shadow. So that should help us place this in the scene a little bit better. Just sets us up really well to work from here. And then we've got these hills to just kind of break up the background a little bit, but we're not going to worry about making them dynamic. They're just there to look nice. So we'll be working in this viewport world. I think with that all set up, it's a good idea to just save the scene file as our starting point, and we'll move on from there. Good time to mention that you get access to all these scene files if you're supporting on Patreon. But we're going to build this completely from scratch here on out, so I don't think anything's going to be left behind. We are going to be shooting a bullet, a cannonball, and then we can shrink it way down so it's more like a musket ball maybe as it crashes through this tree trunk. And we'll change the way the effects look as we go based on the different scales. So to start out with, let's say we're working cannonball scale. Create a sphere, scoot it off to the side a little bit, T for scale, scale it down to be whatever seems like a good cannonball size here. If you want to be precise, I have now scaled it to 31. I arbitrarily scaled it, but that's fine. I've got cannonball material that I will drop on the sphere just so it looks a little bit nicer in the viewport. Let's set up the basic dynamic settings we need for everything. I want the floor to have things collide with it so we can see them fall to the floor. Right click on that, simulation, make that. We can really select any of these. I'll click rigid body. It's not going anywhere. We can now collapse the environment, and I don't think we'll go back in there. And then we have our tree. This is going to be, of course, the important one. I can right click on that, simulation, rigid body. And let's not worry about changing any of the settings yet. And then we've got the sphere. We can also make that a rigid body. We could put these all at the same time. But on this one specifically, we're going to be giving it some speed. So I'll say simulation, rigid body. And we could keyframe it, or we can actually just fling it at the tree, and either is acceptable. In this case, I'm going to fling it at the tree by going to the Dynamics tab, turning on Custom Initial Velocity, and we can figure out that we want to travel on Z plus. So we have X, Y, Z. Type in some sort of number here. I'm not sure how fast we want to go. Let's try 2000 as a starting number. I'm going to hit E for move, scoot this back a little further so we can see it travel in a little bit more. I don't care too much about the specific timing. This is about the techniques. So the way you end up using this should be completely unique. Make sure you make it your own. It's not going to do you any good if you put this, if you make something that looks incredibly similar to this on a demo reel or something. Employers will recognize the source material, so make it your own. Very, very important. Okay, without changing anything else, let's hit play and see what that does. Bunk. Okay, cute. It's running really quickly, flying forward, bouncing off the tree. It's got some pretty good speed to it. The tree is a rigid body, but it's stable, sitting on the ground, and it's stable enough to stop the cannonball from doing much destruction to it. I think it's a pretty good start for us right now. The cannonball is probably a little bit light, but we don't need to worry about changing that quite yet. Now, we're going to get to the magical part. In fact, I think let's hit just save, override the previous file. We're going to get to the magical important part here, and that's going to be fracturing up the tree. That, of course, will be done with Voronoi Fracture, which is inside of the MoGraph menu. Create that, drag the tree to be inside of it, and let's just move our rigid body up to the Voronoi Fracture object so that that will filter down to everything else. Excellent, good start. Of course, by default, it's going to be creating a source that is a random point generator, which is randomly creating currently 20 points all over the place. But we're going to spend a decent amount of time trying to place the fracture, the shards, exactly where we want them to be. So I don't want this randomness. I'm going to delete that and then create a matrix object. The matrix object is amazing for being able to create placement exactly where you want them to be. Now, there's a lot of options that we have here. Creating the matrix by default is going to make a grid array. At least it does in S22. I know that changed at some point. I'll move this into the air until it's about level with a cannonball. A nice clean number here is not a bad idea in case we do multiple objects. So in this case, let's see, what's a good height? You know what? I'm going to move everything up to about 400 exactly. This cannonball can also move up to about 400. If we want to be precise, we can, but not specifically needed. We know that this has a radius of 50, so I think we can shrink down. Actually, I'm looking at T for scale. Scale this entire thing down until it's pretty much perfectly matching there. If you don't want to see your individual blocks from this matrix intersect each other, you can always go into the transform tab and type in, say, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, and they'll shrink down smaller, and we can see them individually. That was a good guess on the scale there. And now we can set the count to whatever we want them to be. Here's something that's neat, though, is currently it's set to per step, which means as I increase or decrease the number, it's going to be getting wider and smaller. But if we change that to endpoint, I can type in any number I like, and the scale of it, make sure it's a bigger number than 1, the scale doesn't change. You see it's just as wide as it ever was, but now we can set the exact count. So the most basic form of this in the Voronoi Fracture, I can drag in the sources, drag in the matrix object, and every one of these matrix objects will create a cut based on where it exists. Now, what it's trying to do is put a slice in between the nearest possible 2 matrix objects, and that would be like a vertical line directly in between them. And the next one is over here. This ends up being perfectly vertical. These are straight lines all the way from the top to the bottom, which is a little bit weird. It's fun, though. I can hit play, and it should smack into that, and these pieces will start to fall away. Of course, that's not doing a very great shatter for us. So a basic thing we might do is grab this matrix object and put some randomness into it. In the cloner, well, the MoGraph menu, I can create a random effector, and that's going to spread these out on X, Y, and Z in all these different directions. So you can now see that it's broken apart, smaller pieces in the middle, and they are all a little bit random. So that's pretty nice. Hitting play now, you can see we'll crash into that. Those smaller pieces in the middle will fall. Of course, they're immediately collapsing. Everything is falling away because gravity is taking over. We will turn gravity back on, but I'm thinking let's just turn gravity off so we're not worried about that part until later. We can do that by hitting Control or Command if you're on a Mac, D, and then inside of here, we can click on Dynamics. In the General tab, there is gravity. No gravity. And there's one last thing. Let's see if we actually see this. If I hit play, yeah, we do see it, but I'm going to frame by frame. Do you see how this starts spreading out a little bit? You see how it's drifting immediately away and there's gaps in between them? That is happening because MoGraph has kind of every MoGraph object, or I'm sorry, dynamic object, has almost like a little bit of a force field around it to improve its calculations. But that force field intersects the other ones. And that force field is actually created by this expert tab, collision margin. If we set that to 0, then now that doesn't have a collision margin anymore. And now if we rewind and frame forward, you're going to see that those are not going to drift apart from each other until this collides with it. So with no gravity, it is nice to just hit play, and that will bump into it, and we see the individual shards. Now, by clustering them up in the center point, you can see that we get more detail right there in the center than we do on these upper sections. That's pretty neat right out of the gate. Now, This can, well, let's see, what's the next step? I don't want, let's create a couple of nulls actually to separate out these sections. They'll be less useful in a little bit, but I think it's a good way to start. Creating a null here. I'll even call this one upper null. Hit E for move this up above, and inside the Voronoi, I'm going to drag this null in as an additional source just to keep it similar. It's upper, so I'm going to move it above the matrix. That is now fed in as a source. And this null, for a lot of these polygons, for this chunk, that is the closest thing for it to reach. So you see all these shards that used to be really long through it, they're getting cut off because this null is technically closer to that section than that one is. So that's where the break happens. Use the same idea below. Create a copy of that null, call it lower. Move it down inside the fracture object. That will be put below. The order doesn't matter. I just like saying organized. And now, depending on where I drag, make sure I accidentally drag that, hit undo, grab lower. If I were to move this up and down, it should actually change where that center point is. At a certain point, it won't anymore. If I move it too far in, it's going to dramatically change the way it looks, but it's a way of separating these sections out. So that's one big chunk, that's one big chunk. And if we hit play, bunk, we can see these pieces fly away. And yeah, that's working pretty well. It's looking all right. Let's make our cannonball heavier. Right now, it's moving at a decent clip, but it's not that heavy, especially compared to this pretty heavy, big, giant log. So the sphere, which I guess we can rename cannonball, I will select its dynamics tag, go to mass, and there's two things we can do. We have currently it's set to world density, so Cinema is just calculating what it thinks its volume is. But we can set that to either custom density or custom mass. Custom mass will be an absolute value. It's going to weigh a certain amount no matter how big or how small it is. A custom density is a multiplier based on what Cinema thinks it should be. Currently, I think we're completely fine doing that. I'm just going to say, hey, whatever Cinema thinks it is, make it about 10 times heavier. So when I hit play, it's going to smash through in a much stronger way. Just by changing that, you see distinctly a much bigger, better explosion. So, excellent little start right there. And then anything else I want to change? No, I think that's all pretty good. So you can now see how we've separated out our separate pieces. Stylistically, if we want this to have more detail in the center, we have to start increasing and increasing and increasing our matrix object. In this case, I'm going to double these numbers, but keep in mind that's multiplying it. So this should be a lot more points. We could hit play, and that's going to shatter through. And every time we increase this count, it's going to take longer for it to calculate. And we will be getting to the point where this will calculate relatively slowly. But you can now see we get these nice chunks shattering out from the center point. Now, something we are seeing is these Voronoi, the way it fractures, everything ends up being very similar in scale. They're not very long. And when trees and wood splinter, they splinter. They're usually long splinter-like shapes. Now, there are ways of playing around with the matrix and laying things out in a way where you can get longer shapes. You can actually see here that we do get some relatively longer ones. But it's not very intuitive. It's not very friendly. So we're going to use a pretty interesting tool inside of the fracture object itself. And that is, usually it's twirled down. So you see the scale cells. Make sure you twirl that down. We can actually scale each of these cells differently. Let's just go ahead and scale it. I've been tinkering around a little bit, so you can do whichever setting you think looks best. But I've been putting 5 in Y, so it's 5 times taller than it's long. I've been liking the way that looks. So as soon as I click that, you see everything's going to scale and everything becomes really tall. Now, something that could be a little bit challenging is this will heavily affect the way that your null is interacting with the other pieces. So it's less intuitive now, where that ends up colliding because all the pieces have been stretched. So even though my null is here, it's not getting cut off until up there. Just keep that in mind. It's not specifically a problem, just something to remember. Now, these should be a lot more splinter-like. I'm going to visually hide this matrix object. Now, if we hit play, that's going to crash through the object, and everything is really tall and splintery, which is pretty neat. And with them being stretched up, something I really like is how this starts looking more like a pencil or a crystal shape. It's a really neat little bit of geometry that ends up being chopped out from there. So that shatters and explodes, everything goes flying away. Pretty neat. Now, we have a lot of options for controlling how these are distributed, but I would like to get a little bit more specific control. This might be going overboard, and I just get really specific with this type of thing. But you know that if this random isn't turned on, all of our matrix objects are very uniform, very flat. If we turn on this random, they're getting pushed randomly out on X, Y, and Z. Now, let's say that I want more clustered up to the center point and fewer as they fall away. I did some tests on this, and here was my result. Let's view it from the side so we can see this very clearly. And actually, let's just keep it really clean. I'm going to hide the fracture for now. You see how essentially density-wise, there's just as many points up at the top as there is in the middle, and like the 3/4. There's a very even distribution. You can see that as I increase or decrease the Y, it's going to maintain a pretty even distribution. But let's say I don't want that very even distribution. We can change that in a bunch of different ways. First of all, I don't want to affect the X or Z. Let's just have this randomly move on Y. So once again, you see very even distribution. Let's let this spread out even more, up to, let's say, 200. So spreading out quite a bit there. But I don't want a lot, maybe a couple points can wander extra far up and extra far down, but I want most of them hanging out near the middle. A easy way of making that work is inside of this random, and let's rename it random Y, because it's only moving up and down Y. Let's go into its fall off tab, and inside there we can create a random field. And this random field is randomly weighting every single one of these clones, and that weighting, you instantly see that there is more density in the center than near the edges. So they have the potential to go all the way up and all the way down, but then they're getting this weighting applied on top of it. So we start getting more of this fall off effect. I think that's pretty neat. Now, yeah, the random by default in this case made a Perlin noise. I don't want a noise. I want this to be, and now just be clear, I am inside of the effector, inside of the field. And inside of there, I don't want the mode to be based off of a noise. I want it to be pure random. So as soon as I turn pure random, then it's just individually assigning each of these a value somewhere between 0 and 1. And now, if I want to control this fall off even more, inside the Remapping tab, I can click on contour mode, click curve, and using the fall off of this curve, I can start making it more likely to have 0 weight, and 0 weight means more towards the center. So just by grabbing this handle and dragging it outward, you're going to see that there's a lot more of them clustering in the center point. And we could even grab this end point and aim it downward, and now it's becoming very unlikely that anything gets to the extreme distance that those are. And now you can see you can get perfect randomness exactly where you want it to be. I think it's pretty cool, and this is probably applicable in a lot of different places. At any point, I could grab this and move it up so everything gets a minimum amount potentially, so they don't get super clustered in the 0 point. So maybe giving it a little bit of a minimum could be a good idea, but I really like that technique. Now, if we go back into the random effector, that if we turn on X and Z, it would be also applying that same fall off to them, and I don't want those getting it applied. So I am thinking that it might be a nice idea to create a second random effector. Grabbing the matrix first, so it automatically applies to it, we can create a second random, rename this one XZ, and apply some randomness, not on Y, but just to X and Z. And it probably doesn't need to go that far. We can go pretty mild on it, something like 5/5, just to get a little bit of randomness in there. And let's let that hang out nearby. Usually like to move them slightly under the object that they're representing. Not needed, just organizationally. So with that all done, we can go and take a look at our fracture again. And now we should just see that there's more of a clustering in the center point, and they fall out as they go. I think that's pretty neat. Let's hit play and see what that ends up giving us as far as a fracture is concerned. Okay, I just really like this fall off of smaller ones to bigger, 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 bigger as they go. It's looking really good. We should probably crank the number up. But before we do, let's save the scene file. 1C. And now let's crank it up. As we crank it up, it's going to get harder and harder to view it in real time in the viewport. Keep that in mind. But we can control this via the matrix. So I could say 44 by 44. Keep in mind that is a lot more clones because it's 44 times 44. I don't expect to see this calculating very quickly, but let's just hit play and let it chug along a little bit. You see frame, frame, frame. It's hitting. It's doing some really nice splintering there. Oh, look how good that's looking. And look at this really smooth transition from one shape to the other. Like it just starts looking really nice. I'm digging that a lot. So that's kind of one basic version of getting nice distribution through everything. But Something that could be cool would be, what if we want the outside of this shape to get more, or to get more pieces and the inside to get fewer? Well, let's keep in mind that we could feed in multiple matrices. So it might be nice to keep this one. I'm going to keep it around, but I'll make a duplicate of it. And let's name this one matrix grid, just so we can keep it in mind, but turn it off. Now we've got another matrix. I'm going to call this matrix outer, because what the idea now is we're going to change it to not be a grid, but instead be radial. And we already know this has exactly a radius of 50. Well, let's make it visible so we can actually see it. And because I just copied it, it is applying these random factors. Let's turn those off temporarily. So now we should see that we get 5 clones in a radius of 50. I can crank that up, and now you can see we got a whole bunch of clones right around the outside of this object. Pretty much exactly what we want to have happen. What's cool about changing this to some, instead of grid, now it's on a matrix radial, we can type in very exact numbers. So if I type in 1111, I know that's exactly how many clones that there are for this matrix object. So here's the idea. What if we make a whole bunch of ones on the outside? So it's kind of like that outer bark layer will have tons of subdivisions, but the inside, we can make it be a little bit, they can have bigger chunks inside. So instead of making, a fancy set of vectors, and we will turn these on for ourselves, but what if we just create a second matrix, call this one matrix inner, and this one, I'm going to temporarily turn off the fracture so we can see this inner one. Let's shrink its radius a bunch, maybe drop it down to 20. And now you can see there's an inner ring and an outer ring. This inner ring, I don't think we need anywhere near as many pieces. Drop it to 222. It's still quite a few. And maybe we'll increase the outer one. In fact, I almost know for a fact that we will, but these are still getting these random effects applied. So I could turn on this random X and Z, and you see those will spread out a little bit from where they are. And we can turn on our random Y, and it'll spread out up and down and get that distribution. But of course, if we view this from the top, you see that we still get those ring effects. Now, we might tinker with that a bunch, but I think it's a cool way of separating out those ideas. And that actually was a suggestion from somebody in the chat. With that going, I can turn on our fracture again, and let's make sure that we are feeding these two matrices in as the source. So currently we have a matrix grid that's turned off, so it's not affecting anything. If we want to be super safe, we could turn it off in here as well. I don't think it's needed, but drag in matrix outer, drag in matrix inner, just give that a second to refresh. And there we go. Now you can see we got all these nice little sections on the periphery, and then there should be some on the inside as well. Now, I think it might be a nice idea. I know we just turned this on, but let's temporarily hide that, even turn it off for a moment, because, well, let's, for clarity, also turn off random Y. Let's say that this inner one, we want those to be more randomly spread out just to fill in that gap. Something that's kind of cool is instead of cranking up our X and Z, which would affect the inside and the outside, we can travel inside of the matrix inner, inside of its effector tab, and I think this works. We can grab the X and Z and start dragging it beyond 100%, and you can see those will spread out randomly more. Now that will fill in this gap quite a bit. So yeah, that'll just fill this in a little bit more, nice and random all over the place, and that should just fill in those gaps nicely. That's what we were going for. So go back to turning on our fracture, activate it, turn on the random Y so that spreads these out. It should fracture all of these different pieces. We get our nice little shards. I don't know how long it's going to take to calculate this because we did just shatter it in a more complex way. But let's visually hide those two matrix objects, give it a quick save. And here's an important thing. I was about to say hit play, but I almost never just hit play. If I make a lot of changes to my dynamic system, I make sure I'm rewound to 0, but I just hit 1 frame forward and I see how long it takes to calculate. Now that took a while, but not that long. If you just click 1 frame forward and it takes 30 seconds for it to calculate, that's a very dangerous thing to just hit play on. Definitely don't want to do that. But in this case, it calculated fast enough. So I think I'm safe to hit play. It's going to, not go fast, but it's reasonable. So now we get a nice hit, all these different shards. I think it's looking pretty nice. Quite happy with that overall. I think we can push it further. We can make more. It's even running pretty quick, but maybe we can grab this outer one and double the numbers. I'm going to say 2222. And the inner one, I don't want them to get too big. So I'll just increase that to 333. Just, we've doubled the number of pieces on the outside. And of course, if we're in the grid, when we multiply two different numbers, it's jumping up to a way larger number. It's not very intuitive, but this radial effect, I think, is a lot more intuitive. Hitting play, we can see the number of shards that we get. Ooh, that's starting to look good. Now, we could keep pushing it further and further and further, and it's not a bad idea to. And once we start sending this to, we're going to start pre-calculating it by sending it to the picture viewer so we can see it in real time. But these are starting to look pretty good. Now, keep in mind that what we had done, we're getting all these nice little shards on the outside, and you can see they get a lot bigger on the inside. That's a difference between these two different matrix setups. But the big point here is how art directable this becomes. We can determine where the layout of these individual pieces are going to be. So that's pretty cool. Let's just, because we're already on the theme of breaking these pieces apart exactly where we want them to be, let's just break apart one last section. Currently, we're telling this to fade out up to the top via just a single null. And because we're stretching everything so much, you can still see that these individual giant shards are still traveling quite far up this object before they sort of fade out to nothing. That could be trouble depending on what we're doing. So a thought would be, what if we make another matrix to create a couple of extra breaks at a point above this section? So yeah, let's do that. We can do it kind of via any layout that we have here. I think this matrix inner might work, but we could also do a grid. In fact, let's do another grid. I'm going to rename this one matrix upper. And it is a grid. It's currently not feeding in because it's a duplicate I just made. So we can see how it's currently getting all the other effectors applied to it. But I don't think we need that many here. I'm going to set it down to, I'm just guessing numbers 6 and 6. There's not that many clones. And I'm going to pull it up to around here to make a couple of extra shards right in that area. So inside the fracture, I can drag that in. Once again, I just like things being in kind of the same order, top to bottom. So this upper will be dragged to below the null, but above the matrix grid that we had fed in. That gets fed in. Give it a second to recalculate, and we should hopefully get a couple of extra chunks up where those pieces were. So those don't become so super stretched out, and there's a couple of extra fractures that we can control right there. So it's just, keep in mind, you can layer and layer these matrix objects up to get additional pieces, which is pretty fun, pretty neat. All right, so I am liking the way that we've got this laid out. We have a lot of control over the way that this got fractured. Let's make it look a little prettier, and that we can do that via applying our materials to it. We aren't going to see the materials if inside of the Voronoi Fracture we have colorized fragments turned on, but we can turn that off just by hitting the checkbox. And the instant we do, we're going to get the bark material popping back out. Now, I want to see a different material, this wood material, on the inside when these pieces break. Now, here's actually an important detail, and I wasn't actually sure about this until I was working on this project. I had originally applied both these materials to the fracture object, and I let them filter down. First of all, we need to apply it to just the inside or the outside, which is really easy. We can turn on selections, and I can choose to do the inside faces or the outside faces, depending on the order. In this case, I'm going to say outside faces, and that just means that this is a selection tag for all the outside faces, which means I can drag the bark to the secondary one and limit it to that. So essentially what that means is this wooden material is getting applied to everything, but the outer bark layer is only getting applied to the outer skin, and it's layered on top of whatever came before it. You could sort of do the inverse. Now, something that I found while practicing this is if you were to run this, play it, render it out, this tree will pass through that material because this material is applied essentially to the parent, and it's not going to filter down properly to the children objects. And I guess a way of showing you that is if I were to make this editable, it's going to take a second to calculate. In fact, I'm going to hit, let's save the C file just in case. 1, B, C, D, E. If I make this editable, it's going to explode this object out into a whole bunch of different pieces, over 2,000 different pieces. And if I twirl it down, you're going to see, okay, we see all these nice individual pieces, but the materials are still above them, which means as these individual objects fly around via dynamics, they're still referencing what comes above. But as an alternative, if I hit undo, if we take these materials and apply them to the tree trunk directly, and now I make it editable. So the only change we made was moving that down, make it editable. When this completes, you're going to see that it's actually copied each of these materials to every single one of the pieces that are being created. And that means they will move with the material instead of through the material. A very important little extra detail there. So undo again. And the cool thing is, like, it will still work with the outside faces because every individual chunk has its own tag for outside faces. So that just continues to work. Excellent. So this should be working quite nicely. I'm going to visually hide our upper matrix object. And let's set ourselves up to start doing some viewport renders. I like cleaning everything up. I don't want to see this little box. That's unneeded. So I will visually hide that as well. Deselect everything because the axis will show up. The basics for the settings here would be Control D. We hit Control D. Actually, I'm sorry, Control B or Command B to open up your render settings. You can also click this button right up there. Pops open your render settings. I want to render in the viewport. So I'm going to set the renderer to viewport renderer because it looks pretty good and we should be able to run pretty quick in that. There's a couple of nice buttons here. We can click copy effects from viewport, and that means it's going to turn on the high quality noises and the shadows, the SSAO, everything that we want from the viewport. And you can also go to the filter and turn on and off these different layers. I personally have my own custom one turned on where I don't see the world grid, all these different things, and I've saved that preset. And I can now click load preset as Chris1, and now all of my preferred things have turned on and off. And I always forget Control or Command B to pop this back open again. And I don't want to save it. Let's set a resolution here. 1080 will give us a nice square render like Instagram. That should run pretty quick. And make sure I set it to all frames so it'll run for the entire simulation. I can crank this up a little bit higher, maybe 222. Actually, we'll just say all frames and we'll increase our timeline to that. So close our render settings, increase our timeline to something a little bit longer. 2022 should work. Double click that. It'll extend to the entire thing. You can now see our overall framing. Zoom up on the relevant area wherever we want to get the most detail. I'm going to view this from a very side, perfectly profile angle. Hit save just to be safe. And now I can click the middle render button, or I think Control or Command R, Shift R. Yeah, Shift R seems to be it. That's actually a shortcut I never use. I always just click the button. It's going to take a moment to do the initial preparation while it breaks it, but now it's going to run essentially the exact same speed that it was in the viewport. But of course, it's caching it here as an animation, so we'll be able to hit play and play back in real time. We can see this shatter happen. All these great splinters go. We can see that the material is stuck to the individual shards, and for a viewport render, it looks pretty nice. So that's exploding quite nicely. All of our different parts are flying around. Keep in mind there is no gravity, so these are just flying and doing whatever they want. But we can rewind, hit play. Oh, that looks pretty great. I'm actually pretty pleased with that. Now, depending on what you're doing, this could be fine. You want no gravity. You just want to see that like split second of this collision. So that could be done. You could be like, all right, happy with that. Don't need any more. But of course, we're going to be pushing this even further. Let us stop the render. Close the window. It takes a second to close, so just keep that in mind. I'm not sure why the viewport takes a second, but it's just kind of getting back into this mode. And that's all good. Hit Control S just to save over the previous file. And what changes do we want to start making here? Well, I think one good thing that we could do is activate our gravity again. Let's say we do want gravity to be a variable here and these things to start falling. Hitting Control D or Command D, we can go into Dynamics, General, and change gravity back to default. We can just right click on the little up and down arrow, reset it to its default of 1,000 centimeters per second, I think. I'm not sure. And then, I mean, that'll just automatically work. But of course, this object is already dynamic. The entire thing's dynamic. So if we were to let this start running, in fact, why don't we just send it back to the picture viewer? It's not saving. And so we get this pretty easily. This is going to immediately, even before the cannonball comes in, it is collapsing. You see the entire thing is beginning to fall and fall apart. So we don't want that. Now, there's a couple of different options that we can do. I'm going to stop that right away. We don't have to let that go for too long. A couple different options you can do, but what's the best way of showing this? You saw how well everything was exploding forward. That's a really cool feature. We want that. Now, there's a really nice feature inside of Dynamics, which is under the Dynamics tab, and that is when should the Dynamics trigger? Currently, they are triggering immediately, but they're immediately triggered, which means they're starting to fall with gravity. There is a setting in there called on collision. So they're not going to do anything until they collide with something. And it has to be at a particular speed for that collision. So they should all just be sitting there, which is really nice. And it does work, but let me see if we can see the problem. This, because I made the cannonball so heavy, maybe it won't show up as a problem, but let's just see if it works. Okay, yeah, actually it is showing the problem pretty well. What's happening is this cannonball is flying in really quickly. I'll stop that from rendering right away because we can demonstrate this. It's flying in really quickly, and these objects are not activated until it's been collided with. But if this frame, it's collided with, but the forces weren't applied to it immediately. They're not applied until the frame after, so it's kind of getting left behind. And you see we get a very different simulation happening here, where, yes, it didn't start falling apart, and we do still get a bit of an explosion flying out the front, but that's pretty different than, let's just click on our previous frames. You'll see here that, I know it's starting to fall, but this, when it hits, you can see that they start actually pushing outward backwards, which is pretty neat. And then immediately everything is reacting, and then it's exploding out the front, and all these pieces are being driven forward. That is way more accurate. That's way better. We want that. So honestly, I don't think we need to overthink this. What I have been doing is just finding the frame before the cannonball collides with everything, and that is the frame that I'll let it start animating. So actually, instead of even hitting play there, we can just frame through here, and we can see that the cannonball hits on frame 5. So I want, at frame 5, the dynamics to have turned on. This is really straightforward. All I'm going to do is go to my dynamic tag, and at frame 5, if you hold down, here's a very important thing, hold down Alt. As you're holding down Alt, you can see I can actually scrub through my timeline, and it's not trying to refresh everything, which is really nice. So at the time of 5, I want dynamics to be on. So I'll turn that on. And then, holding down Alt, I'll go back a single frame. And at frame 4, I want dynamics to be off. So everything before 4, it's off. Everything after that, it's on. So not just doing any other change, send this back to the picture viewer so we can see it in real-ish time. It's just nice to be able to scrub, especially in the context of a tutorial. And later I'll probably start... Oh, I made a mistake. I forgot to turn off. Give that a moment to close. I forgot to turn off on collision. So I'm going to say immediately. So they're immediately on, but not until dynamic turns on. So let's try that. Later on, when we're doing longer test renders, I'll probably jump to the end. But for now, these are coming in pretty quick. So now what's cool is you actually see right there, as we get to frame 5, it suddenly chugs for a little bit because it's like, oh, we're suddenly all dynamic. But now it didn't start pre-falling from gravity. And now gravity does turn on, and they all start getting blasted through. So best of both worlds, gravity isn't turned on until the moment we want the cannonball to hit, and then everything can start to fall. So we're getting really nice shatter. Everything's flying away. I really like that, this one piece twirling around. So that's working quite well. I'm actually very pleased with that. But let's say that we want even more control over this. Right now, our stump is getting very shattered. It's exploding everywhere. Let's say we wanted to limit this to not affect every single piece everywhere. Let's stop that render one more time and do the next effect. In fact, before we do, let's save the scene file ABCDEF. All right. You'll see here in our dynamics tag, which is attached to the fracture, inside the dynamics tag, we have something called a MoGraph selection that we can drag in. That's interesting. What does that mean? Well, it means we can right-click on any cloner-based object, which a Voronoi Fracture is, and create a MoGraph. Actually, there's two different ones. There's the MoGraph selection tag and the MoGraph weight map. But the MoGraph selection is what we want here. What the MoGraph selection tag is essentially a tag saying true or false. Is it selected or is it not for every single clone, every single chunk in here? If we select the tag, we can turn on an incredibly useful feature, which is use fields. As soon as we turn that on, we can control this via fields, of course. Delete the freeze, we don't need that. And you'll see that there's a tolerance. Anywhere that's above 50%, it will be marked as true. So let's do the simplest possible version of this. I'm just going to create a spherical field. Move it up to 400, which we've determined is our 0 point. So up to 400. And at 400, you now see we have a spherical fall off, and all of those have been selected and marked as true. Something I like to do, because it's a tolerance of 550, we could crank this up, but I like just going into our spherical field under remapping, and I crank up the inner offset. So you see it's actually full strength anywhere inside. So anywhere inside of the circle is going to be fully selected, and those are now dynamic. Everything outside of it is not dynamic. Now there's a lot of chunks here, a lot of clones. So I'm going to expand this by manually typing in a larger number. And you can see that that made that larger. Dragging, it's going to be a little slow. You can see it's chugging just from the refresh as my mouse moves. You can see how it's getting lagged a little bit behind. There's just a lot going on. Now we made the selection really straightforward. If we go into our dynamics tag, I can drag that selection in to this MoGraph selection. You see it's actually linked to, it's on the same line as dynamic. So that's saying what is allowed to be dynamic and what isn't. Now it is subservient to whatever that's set to, but when this turns on, only the ones that were marked in yellow that were selected are going to be valid dynamic objects. I don't want to see this spherical fall off, so I'm going to visually hide that, deselect everything, and let's send it to the picture viewer one more time. And I hope you see how simple that workflow is as far as making a MoGraph selection and then combining it with fields to use the fall off to place that exactly where we want to. So give this just a couple of frames to let the cannonball come flying in. It should hopefully smack into our tree. It's shattering very nicely, but you'll immediately notice that the trunk isn't going anywhere. And additionally, the top isn't going anywhere. Depending on what you're doing, that could be what you want. But it might, depending on the structure you're doing, that might be defying gravity. So keep that in mind. But these pieces being static and not being able to move, this is an incredibly powerful tool for us to art direct exactly how we want these to move. Now we can see other pieces are starting to slowly fall away as as they are collided with, and if they're kind of stuck in these other pieces, but there's a lot of motion happening. It's pretty good. We're getting to the point where we might start making multiple changes as we go, as we start trying to tweak things. But let's hit play and see what we end up with. Rewind, play. Ooh, that's good. I'm gonna stop it from rendering because I've got enough frames. Let's play this through a few times. It's stopping from rendering. Yeah, there we go. While it's chugging along there, it can definitely take over. Hit play, and now we can see we get this really great, I mean, it's a really great kind of crash through explosion. And now we could start art directing things even more. What is supposed to be broken, if the pieces are too big, too small. You see these nice big chunks in the center, which we intentionally designed to be that way. All the small, tiny little ones on the outside flying, the size of the cannonball, where it stops and where it's applied. I'm actually quite pleased with that. Close the window, and let's make this maybe not fancier, but let's change the fall off that we currently have. I want to see the spherical field again, but I don't want it to be a spherical field. This time I want it to be, let's say, a linear field. I always guessed this incorrectly, so I'm going to put it on. Actually, I think I did it wrong before, so I'm going to remember, which is Y+. So this should be facing up and down. Takes a long time for it to do that refresh because of, once again, all of the different chunks we have. Let's select the selection tag, and now you can see how everything above where it starts and up is dynamic and everything below is not. That's exactly what we want. In the linear field, I'm going to set the length down to 1. Don't set it to 0 because it can be a little bit weird at 0. So give it a little bit of size. And now exactly wherever that line is where it's going to be dynamic or not dynamic. I shall move that down to, I'm just guessing, Y200. That seems pretty good. Everything below will not be dynamic. Everything above can be dynamic. And yeah, that should be pretty much that. We have exact placement of what is dynamic and what is not. All of those should be affected by gravity, and it should be able to fall away. I think it's looking good. Save it, and let's just do it to the picture viewer one more time. All right, I let that pre-roll for about a minute just to skip over. We can hit play, see what we end up with. Nice shatter. This bottom is static and everything else is falling through. Working quite well, but now we can start, taking more direct control over what we want to have happen. You can see that we're getting these really long shards up here on the top. I think it might be a nice idea to create a couple of extra subdivisions up there so they're not quite as long. And the entire thing is falling over and then shattering through the base, which is, I like that. I mean, it kind of falls and then shatters a second time, which, that's cool with me. So let's make that tweak, which is going to be pretty much taking our matrix upper, and let's activate it and even scroll around until we see it. Where is that one hiding? It might just be inside of it. Yeah, it's actually right there. It's a little hard to see, but we just want more breaks there, more places for it to break. So Let's put it to 12 and 12. That's just going to create some more sections. That should be able to break more than it currently is. And then let's see. Let's take a look at actually that render again and see what other tweaks we would like to make to it. Everything is falling. That shattered forward is great. We could create more chunks if we want to, less chunks. I think it might be nice to make some of these inner ones a little bit smaller. So I'm going to take that inner radial matrix and make more of them. So that will break even more. And that's shattering quite nicely. And then we'll take a look at that, and then I know what we'll do next. So we got more here. Grab the inner matrix, and currently there is 300 of them. Yeah, I'm gonna make 777 of them. That'll be a decent little bump. They'll be about half the size in general. And I'm gonna render it again, but I'll be zoomed out just a little bit more, get a little bit more of a context of the overall shape. Hit save, send it to the picture viewer. About 50 seconds of pre-rolling there. Let's take a look. Oh, that's so much better already. Look at how nice that is. This shatters through. Those smaller chunks are letting this whole thing separate out more. And you can see up here how these are breaking in this nicer way. They're still very vertical, but there's just more of them, so it's not quite as blatant. And those can start falling down and shattering a little bit more. But eventually, we will get to these chunks that are really long, and they're kind of splitting the tree all the way up the length. And I don't think that is realistic in this case. So what could we do there? Well, and this is actually going to be applicable in a couple of different places, but there's a pretty cool feature that was added into Voronoi Fracture in R19, and that is the ability to connect all these different pieces together. And it's actually really simple. Inside of our fracture object, there's something called connectors. If we click Create Fixed Connector, it'll actually create a single fixed connector right here. This is essentially a proxy. This is a reference for the way it's going to connect all of the different pieces inside of here. It's automatically doing the math to figure out which piece should connect to which piece. It's essentially connecting to every single neighbor. Now, by default, they've got some pretty nice numbers typed in here. I'm confident in typing in and or changing the 4 to an 8 and doubling the strength of both the torque and the force. And it should just make these be more connected to each other. But just to show you really quick what it's doing, this isn't a single connector magically connecting everything. If we make this editable, and it will take a moment to calculate because there's a lot of objects going on now. So that will spin a bit. When we expand, even expanding that takes a little bit. I can begin scrolling down. You can see that we have thousands of different tree parts. But eventually, when we get to the bottom, we're going to have a connector tree. And if I twirl that down, there is now a connector for every single connection going on. And every piece has more than one connection. So there's a lot of those. I'm going to hit undo. Maybe, yeah, just one time. So that undid. But keep in mind that there's a lot of fixed connectors connecting all those different parts. And this is just a very clean way of displaying it to the user, but there's actually a lot of work going on in the background. Not changing anything else except for having doubled the strength of that connector. I am going to send it back to the picture viewer. A minute 30 of pre-rolling, and let's check this out in real time. Oh, again. Oh, that's so good. Like, okay, this is where things start getting really fun. These individual pieces are attempting to maintain their connection between them, and there's actually a lot of force holding it together. So we're going to start getting a very different simulation. These pieces want to stay stuck together. Now, they can get forced apart via the dynamic settings, but as this shatters through, you see these actually want to stay connected. And a very, 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 very important detail right now. Fixed connectors are not like this perfect absolute thing. They can still bend and flex a little bit. So you see we get these little cracks there. Those will show up in the final render. There's no way around that. But that's why this technique works a lot better in something like wood than it would, say, concrete or something, or especially glass. In glass, it can't like sort of break and go back. It's not flexible like that. But wood is. So I think these pieces flexing out a little bit, and then it kind of makes for this really cool little snap right there, and it still kind of blends back in. So those bending like that is a lot better when it comes to this type of thing. As the weight of the rest of the tree comes falling down, it's actually continuing to break and snap these additional pieces apart, which I think is just absolutely wonderful. Like, that looks so good. there's I mean, it's just, this is working wonderfully. It's exactly the way I want it to. I think that the next thing I'd like to do is zoom the camera out a little bit, and let's get a little bit more control, or let's check out how our pieces are flying and potentially settling, and then make some changes to the dynamics depending on the result that we see. I want to see a little bit of the floor, actually a decent amount of space here. That should be fine. And let it calculate again. All right, that was looking so good as it went. I let it go a little bit extra long. I lost a couple of our opening frames, so I don't have quite enough RAM to have cached all that, but let's check out what we end up with. I'm going to play. Oh, that's so good. It even falls over and flips some pieces in the air. Like, I'm very, very, very pleased with the way that that is looking. It's really fun. Now, the main thing I want to pay attention to is how these pieces are flying and how they're bouncing off the ground, because all the stuff on the tree is wonderful. Hit play. Actually, it's pretty good overall. They're bouncing, flipping, and some of these extra pieces are doing a good job of rotating, breaking, getting flung in the air. Now, I wouldn't mind the pieces bouncing off the ground a little bit. I don't think that's unrealistic, but and I don't know how well we'll be able to fix this. I've never found a catch, a problem that completely solves this, but you do always end up with that problem where some of the little pieces are going to be gaining lots of energy and trying to escape and fly all over the place, especially if they start twirling and spinning and gaining lots of energy from that. Now, some of it's not necessarily unrealistic. It's hard to tell and to track any one piece. A theory I've always had is that they start spinning out of control and has a lot of rotational energy and hits the ground, and that spin is going to fling it up into the air with a lot more force than is justified, but it's hard to track any one piece back to what it's doing. So that is, oh man, it looks so cool. And we're going to be doing some more stuff that should make this look even better. But let's just tweak a couple of settings that might help us with that, see if it improves it, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Currently, these dynamics will fall asleep if it gets to a certain point. That's, in this situation, probably a good thing. Under collision, it's got very little bounce and a decent amount of friction. Keep in mind that's multiplied by how it interacts with the floor. So I might select that and the floor tag by holding that control. I can grab both of them. So I don't mind them bouncing a little bit. So I might set that to them both up to about 25. And then now going back specifically to just the fractures dynamics, we can go into the force tab. I'm sorry, not the force tab. Yes, the force tab. I misclicked to the mass. In the force tab, we have got a couple different settings that can help us out a little bit here. We've got angular damping, linear damping, and also our aerodynamics. These are ways of draining energy out from the system. Currently, it's already defaulting to draining out a little bit of energy, and something like gravity is constantly adding energy in, so that's pretty acceptable. Something I think might be nice is draining out a lot of rotational energy. If they're twirling really fast, it will drain the energy out, and they'll start slowly not spinning as fast. And that could go a long way to stopping the little random pieces from flying all over the place. Not a guarantee, but we can try it. Now, in general, you got to put a pretty high number in here. I'm going to do 80. 80 will... I always feel like 80 feels more like what you would intuitively feel would be like 20%, and 90 ends up being like 50%. So this is actually this isn't that high in spite of being 80. Now, there's also aerodynamics. I really love aerodynamics. They're really cool, but man, they are really powerful. A little bit goes a crazy long way. I know for a fact that 1% will be too much. Pieces that start flying out will fly out quickly and lose their energy really fast instead of continuing forward. But a little bit of drag, a little bit of lift will go a long way to draining out the overall energy. But like I said, I want a light touch on that. So I'm going to set to 0.1, 0.1 on both of those. Hopefully it stops it from going crazy, but we won't visually see too much drag. But them slowing down a little bit, it's not unrealistic. They are traveling through the air. But yeah, like I said, 1% itself is too much. I think that might be the only change that I make here. The way everything was shattering and breaking was great. Keep in mind, you can go to your connector and make it even stronger so they don't want to break, or you can make them weaker so it's easier for them to break. But yeah, that's working well for me. Deselect everything. Actually, let's save the scene file. Seems like a wise idea. 1G, and back to the picture viewer. 2 minutes and 30 seconds later, let's see if there's any sort of improvement. Okay, I'm going to definitively say yes, but it's not total. None of these are jumping up into space, but there's still definitely a couple of hopping ones that don't want to lose all their energy. So I feel like those are the right tools to help. But once again, I've never had a perfect solution for those little ones that want to escape. Now, I'm not going to do it, but there is one method that you can do. And usually what it would be is you bake your simulation, and then you can make a MoGraph selection tag and sort of paint on the ones that are not behaving, and then create a plane effector and scale those to 0. Or you can even do it over time, scale those to 0. It's a little bit manual, and there might be better ways of doing that, but I can't think of any right now. But this definitely calmed them down a decent amount. And you know what? Maybe you could even keyframe it like right around now. All the crazy dynamics have happened. So keyframing up more drag or keyframing up more linear, keyframing up some more linear or angular damping could start forcing these to slow down even more. Potentially, even you could create I'm just spitballing ideas here. You could create a giant friction force and give it a fall off, and if it starts escaping that fall off, it starts getting more friction applied, and it would stop it from flying away too much. These are all just ideas, experiments. I'm not going to spend time looking into those, but just keep them in mind. Now, we've only got a couple of other kind of new features I want to add in here, and then we will even continue a little bit after that with a couple of extra bonus things. One thing I would like to do here is let's try shrinking our cannonball a lot smaller until we're more in the realm of like this being like a musket bullet, something pretty small. I'm not going to go crazy small, but okay, we'll do a radius of 5. So it's pretty tiny now. I don't expect this to have that much of an effect as it hits because it is so small. In fact, I'm so confident it's not going to have too much of an effect. Let's immediately crank up its mass, its density. So currently it's at 11. I'm going to do 111. I still don't think that's going to be enough, but that is enough for an experiment. And then another thing I would like to do is, what if we just wanted like a chunk of this tree to come flying out? I think it should be pretty simple to do that. To start out with, let's grab our bullet and scoot it to the side a little bit. Actually, it's going to be hard to see from that point of view, so I'm going to look at it from this angle. Click your middle mouse button, and you can easily jump to all 4 views, and then this one. I want to grab my bullet and scoot it closer to the right. Oh boy, it's really, I'm going to rewind all the way. Everything should calculate a little bit quicker at frame 0, but it still might choke a little bit. All right, as I move this over, I want it to be off center like that. So it's going to graze the tree a little bit more. It's still hitting it pretty solidly, but it's not the dead center. Now, keep in mind, right now, we're telling this linear field to be where it can be dynamic. The thought here is, what if we just want like a bite to come out of the tree and everything else can be static? If that's our goal, I want to change my linear field to be a cylindrical field. So it's a cylinder, and I want to travel along Z. So I'll say Z plus, and we should see a circle shape, but it's a cylinder, so it should be shooting out on the Z axis. You know, it's taking a long time to calculate. I'm just going to turn off the fracture for a moment, and now we should be able to move things in real time. I can move this exactly where the ball is going to hit, although if we want to, we could scoot it a little bit more forward. Actually, I think that's probably a good idea. I'll scoot that more forward. T for scale that down just a little bit. And here's something I didn't think would work, but it totally does. I want this to scale up a little bit more. I like the cylinder, but I want it to be a cylinder shape that's stretched up. If we go to the coordinates tab, I can scale this up on Y, say times 2, and now it's going to double up, and it's scaled up, and that will still work, surprisingly, which is pretty cool. Now, if we turn back on the fracture object, it's going to take a second to calculate all the fracturing. Give it that moment, a long moment, lots of chunks. We can grab the selection tag, and actually it needs to refresh. So I'm going to turn it off and turn it on. Hopefully that forces a refresh. There we go. Now you can see that is the selection of things that are valid to get broken. So now let's grab pretty much our previous camera view. Just eyeball that, move it back around there. And let's see if this tiny little bullet has enough strength to hit, and what happens if just those pieces are broken. Deselect everything. Actually, yeah, that's working quite well. Send that to the picture viewer, although I bet I'm going to stop it pretty quickly because I think it's not going to weigh quite enough for what we're throwing at it. Or I guess what it is being thrown at. It comes flying in. Now the dynamics turn on. It's going to hit. It actually does a pretty good little pop there, but you can see everything is pretty resistant. It's kind of shattered all of these pieces, but it wasn't enough to get all the way through. And so like those will sort of break a little bit, but you will see that the rest of the tree is being completely static. It is not dynamic. So these little breaks won't get beyond where that cylinder was telling it that they were allowed to go. So this could be what you want. You want that little shatter look. It's pretty neat. That is not a bad thing. That is a totally valid thing to even be aiming for. Let's just see what it looked like in real time. Actually, even that's kind of cool. It's like, even a couple little splinters fall out from the other side. So that's neat. Of course, if it's not powerful enough, it was pretty good. But if we make this 10 times as powerful again, I'm just going to add another one on the end, send that to the picture viewer. That's got to be way stronger. The last one almost made it through. I bet we could have just doubled or tripled it, but now it's 10 times as strong. It's 10 times as heavy again, more than 1,000 times as heavy as it would be default. So I bet that this is going to blast right through that thing. So yeah, even the smaller bullet was able to do that hit. In fact, with it being a smaller bullet, it looks like the outside here was able to survive that hit, and just some of these other pieces came out. Now, some things to keep in mind right away. We did make the inside chunks thicker. We made those be bigger pieces that are going to have a lot more trouble flying out of the structure. So if we made this entire thing be broken a little bit more evenly, maybe more pieces would come flying out. In addition to that, we also have our fixed connector making connections between all these pieces, and these become reluctant to break. That should be good. The pieces are all settling down pretty well. Actually, we'll give it a frame or two to see if they land on the ground. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a couple stragglers that try and escape. And I wouldn't mind seeing how stable this is. All right, good enough. Give it that moment to calculate, and boom, hit play, pop. I love this little flex right there. So yeah, it blasts through. We get these nice little pieces. It even slows the bullet down a little bit. You can see it start to drop with gravity. And I mean, once again, it's an excellent result. I like that. One, just for fun, I'm going to select the connector and significantly weaken. Should we cut it in half? I'm going to actually cut it in 4. So I'm going to say 2 and 2. So they do want to hold together, but they're a lot more free to fall apart. I might also, well, no, that'd be dangerous. I was going to speed up the cannonball, but we're currently activating gravity at a particular time, and I don't want to reset that because it's going to take a little bit to do the calculation. So we'll just let this hit again. This is pretty much where I'm going to end as far as tinkering with the fixed connector and the smaller cannonball, but I do like this overall effect. And it shouldn't take too long until we immediately see it fly in. And let's see if it being a little bit weaker, if these can shatter out a little bit more, because each piece can push on the next one. Yeah, this is definitely doing a lot more of an explosion. And actually, yeah, I wanted to make that be more powerful because these are all pieces that are valid to get shattered, but these ones in the back can never fall. So we still have a lot of the tree can survive that hit. And that is, yeah, you get this great tree texture in there where it's all vertically split like a tree would be. And we still get all of our fragments falling to the ground. Looking pretty cool. I like that. Excellent. That's far enough to see the initial explosion. I will pause it. It does take the second to, I'm not sure if it's caching or what it's doing, but it ends. Hit play. Very nice. We can ignore that last frame. It's like only partially calculated, so it looked kind of weird, but we can ignore that. And if you want to, you can even tick that down so it doesn't render that last one. So yeah, a cute little bullet flying through, knocking out this big chunk, but everything above, below, and behind is not even the candidate for becoming dynamic. Working very, very nicely. All right. I like that. I will save the scene file. So if you're on Patreon, you can get access to this one. But I think I'm going to rewind, or I'm going to hit undo a bunch of times. Actually, it's going to take a little bit to do that, so hopefully this works. I'm going to go back to G, because I want to get back to where we had the larger cannonball to do the final effects that we had. So all this should be set up well. Everything was looking great. It's right before we made the tiny cannonball. And that is because what I would like to do right now is cache the timing of this and see if we can do a little bit of time manipulation on it. That should be actually pretty straightforward, but it's going to take a long time to calculate the dynamics. And keep in mind, we've left all of our dynamics for this entire thing at, let me rewind to 0 again. We've left all of our dynamics calculating. We are still in 5 steps per frame. We could crank this up significantly and get it to look a lot more accurate. Those fixed connectors are heavily affected by how cranked up the steps per frame is. So moving this up to 15 or 25 would go a long way to really stiffening that part of this up. But it's still running, I mean, it's running pretty dang well at our 5 steps per frame. We can crank up the numbers and all that, but I'm perfectly happy with it as it is. I would like to cache this. So the cache is going to take as long as we feed in frames though. So I'm going to drop this down to 100 frames, which will still take a little while to calculate, but all of our animations were wrapping up around 100 units. So that seems like a good place to go. This will take a little bit of time, but if you hit Control or Command D under Dynamics, under Cache, there's a big button here for Bake, and that's going to bake all of the dynamics in the entire scene, and that is what I want to have happen here. So I'll click that button, and there we go. It's all pre-baked. Now, you see how long it's taking to refresh everything? It's not like we can suddenly scrub through our timeline, but what we can do is manipulate our time and our playback using the cache tab. So we can turn on Use and now keyframe our playback. Now, the best way, you can keyframe it kind of however you want, but something I like doing, and I'm not exactly an expert in this, but at the time of 0, I'm going to even, important detail, hit Control or Command D. Actually, we're already there. Click on Key Interpolation, and currently it's interpolating via a spline, so it's trying to smooth in, and ease out. I say, no, you're linear. Do a linear interpolation. Cool. Now, back into Dynamics, back into Cache. At the time of 0, it'll be at 0. Fast forward all the way to the very end. It's probably going to try and refresh, but at the end, we're at frame 100. So let's say, okay, at the end, you're at frame 100. A linear interpolation, it's going to end there. So we have now said, yes, behave exactly the way you have been behaving. But then I can go into the playback time. I'm going to right click on playback time, animation, show F-curve. Now in this, there is no controls for our playback time, but it does have a section for a time track. So I think I can right click on Dynamics, because that's where this lives, add a special track and add a time track. This is now going to be a linear track from 0 to 100%. You can select both those keyframes and hit the letter F, and then actually, let's hit the letter S, and that will zoom in and kind of frame those up. These have now become controls that we can use to remap our time. And we can see our handles. I think if we click this ease in and ease out, we now have these nice handles we can control. So let's see, I'm thinking, let's very quickly accelerate in for that first part. And then at the end, we can quickly do the end part. But then holding down Control or Command, I can click a new keyframe right near the middle and spin this and flatten it out. Now it's currently locked, so I'm going to turn off lock tangent lengths. And with that, I can pull that out further. And this is now flattening the time. Now, I'm not sure exactly when the cool explosion part happens, but I think it happens pretty early. It kind of sucks that we have to do this blind, but it's just not going to refresh quick enough in the viewport. And I think this will work pretty well. And we can make tweaks after the fact. So I'm going to make these handles pretty long to make this really slow down in the Matrix type of way. And I don't want to flatten it out. If it goes flat, it'll completely stop time. You see it's constantly moving forward slowly. But if you want to, keep in mind, you could move forward in time, and I could make another keyframe, drag that down, and that would be moving backward in time, because if this line ever dips down, we're going backward in time and then forward in time. Now, I don't actually want to do that. I will hit undo, and now we get this nice long flat handle. Now, that is not currently applying to our playback time, but if we select our playback time, there's the time track, drag in the time track we just made, and that will feed it in, and that is now enabling the remap of that time. This should be pretty good framing. Actually, I think it'll look a little bit cooler if we're zoomed up a little bit more. So let's frame this up, center it a little bit, and send that to the picture viewer. All right, 2 things to note. This wasn't quite the timing I wanted it to be, so I'm going to tweak that right away. And the other thing to remember is actually the ball is dynamic. I think that would be retimed with it. I'm not sure, but let's go back into our time track. So window, timeline, F curve, select our dynamics, and there's the curve. Once again, I want to frame up, so letter S, And it looks like our the big cool explosion part happens really early. So this entire thing needs to get pulled way down to, I don't know. Once again, we're just guessing. So right around there, we're going to say the slow way down. And this initial part's getting skipped over, but maybe I'll give that a little bit of a curve in there as well. Once again, just kind of a blind guess based on the feedback I saw. Send it back to the picture viewer. Okay, that completed. It was looking pretty good. Let's see what we got. Okay, that was almost spot on. It might have been nice to go if it should hit just a little bit later. But a couple things I want to point out. You see how easy it was to remap the time. The shadows look a little bit funky right there, but that's just going to be because we're in the viewport renderer. That's working pretty well overall. This explosion coming out is so smooth. Look at that. Now, that's the main thing I want to point out is while we're getting this really cool explosion, something that's really cool about baking the dynamics this way is it's storing the PSR, the position, scale, and rotation of all of our different clones, all of our different chunks here. And each of those can be interpolated between. So we can go as slow as we want to, and it can do that perfect transition in between those different states. So this isn't like suddenly popping from frame that was keyframe to frame to frame. It can smoothly transition between any state here. And we get those really great transition through. Like, I just really love that. The dynamics work wonderfully. As we hit this, you even kind of get, I think it'd be realistic as these different parts have different strains on them. Some of these pieces actually fly backwards out of it just because of the way it's kind of cantilevered. It's pivoting from this midpoint, and that's where it snaps and flings other parts out. This shattering through the overall tree, you can see the entire thing flex, and then after it snaps all these relevant parts, the top part gives way and the entire thing begins collapsing. And then, of course, everything accelerates through, and it can do the end part here. You can zoom out a little bit to see it better. And it's playing faster than real time at the end, so this starts running maybe a little bit quick, but there you can see how we can remap that time, make that look however you want, make that take as long as you want. Like, this could take 1,000 frames of slowly transitioning between, but just a little bit of matrix type retiming, really fun. Shatters, falls over, love it, looking really good. So I think that wraps up the main thing. I just wanted to throw in essentially one last bonus part, and hopefully this file won't be too large because it is going to be a baked scene file. I'll even call it baked just in case. One last idea. We were throwing all this at just this log, and that's limiting it to this basic shape. But what if there was something more complex you wanted to be running this on? Well, I mean, and first of all, let's clear out our dynamics, Control D. We don't use our playback time. We can even hold down Control and Shift and D, get rid of those keyframes so you don't need that retiming. Clear the cache so we're back in real time. And just so everything's going to run quicker, you know what? I'm going to select the outer, and this has a lot of chunks. I'm going to drop it down to 555. The inner has a lot. I'm going to drop that down to, 222. A lot less chunks going on. It should start playing back a lot quicker for us. This is running on a very simple object, and it's clearly not a tree. It's just a big giant log, which would be great for a telephone pole or whatever shape we want to throw at it. We could make, a cube. We can make a big cube here, move that up, T for scale, stretch it up, and we completely have the option to pull out the tree and swap in that to be the chunk that's going to be calculated now. Make the cylinder not calculate, so that should be the shape that we get. I can even move the material on there, so the entire thing is going to be whatever the bump material I applied, and that should run through that pretty well. It's a lower calculation, so it should run relatively well. Hit play, and we can see that shatter, hopefully in a similar way. I mean, it seems to be structured slightly differently, so you can see it kind of punching in. So that's throwing in a different object like that, but that's still not that complicated of an object. So let's pull that out and make it kind of difficult on ourselves. I'm going to go into the content browser, and inside, if you downloaded the different presets that Maxon provides, inside of 3D Objects Volume 1 from Maxon, there's a folder called Plants, and inside of there we have European trees, and inside there we've got a bunch of different tree types. Which one did I run the test on? Just because I know it sort of worked. Okay, this cherry tree. You can drag this cherry tree into the scene, and now we just get this random tree from Maxon providing it. And the only reason I chose this one is it kind of has a thicker trunk, so we can actually kind of see something happen. Now, the Maxon stuff comes in with some espresso and settings. I just want to clean that up a little bit. So I don't need any of those settings. Delete the controls. Selecting these, I can hit Alt-G, and it's going to group that, rename that tree. And the last thing I'd like to do is separate out the trunk of this tree from the rest of it. And, just for it to match the scale, the tree's a little small as compared to our overall scene. So I'm going to T for scale, make this bigger, which, I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I don't want to shrink the ball or anything. Everything's already placed in those spots. Just to be quicker, I'm going to scale that up. So this is approximately back to where we had been. Now, we've got two different things, a leaf object and all the tree trunk, branches, all of those. I would like to separate out the trunk specifically. So under tree, we've got all these different pieces, but if I click on polygons, you see we got a nice low polygon mesh. Select just any polygon from the trunk, hit UW. You can see we selected all the polygons involved in it, and hit the letter UP, and it's going to split that into a separate object. And then we can go to the original object, and you see that we still have the original one selected. Delete that. We have now split the object into two pieces. So now we have a trunk object. Excellent. Now, of course, the trunk object is the one that we are going to want to shatter. I'm going to drag the trunk into our fracture object in the proper spot, hopefully down there. Give it a second to calculate, and I think it's just immediately done that. A couple things we should address, though. Let's make sure that our matrix objects are approximately in the right spot. They're not bad, but you can see how everything's like scooted over a little bit. We could move the tree into those. We could move the matrix objects into those positions. I'm not gonna super worry about this. This is just kind of a little bit of bonus information. But I'm gonna select the inner and outer, and just eyeball this and scoot it a little more on the trunk. You see it's not lining up perfectly with it. I'm just not gonna worry about it. And I suppose I get a T for scale and scale those down a little bit until they're intersecting just that bit. Grab the matrix upper for where those were breaking, and just make sure that that is also essentially intersecting those branches where it might be relevant. And I guess maybe I should scoot those forward a little bit because those seem to have gotten a little too far back. Okay, once again, I'm being super rough with this. All right, excellent. Now, hopefully that matrix object, this fracture has been updating and changing that. So if I hit NB, we can see this is already pre-shattered. I did lower the count just so this runs a little bit quicker. We've got that tree. We've got this cannonball. I think, hopefully it's safe to, well, I'll save it before. I don't want to lose it. So hit save, HIJ. And I think it's safe to just hit play here and let it run right into it and shatter. Something you'll see right away is it turns out that this tree trunk is hollow. There's no top or bottom to it. So with that being the case, you see these are hollow. It's like shattering a little outside shell. So we need to fix that. Rewind all the way. Really easy to fix. We can fix the original geometry, but you can go to your fracture and turn on under object. There's a optimize and close holes checkbox. Turn that on, and that should do it for us. Okay, that does that. Now we hit play again. This comes flying in, and that shatters, and you can now see we get all those nice little chunks flying out, working quite nicely. But the inside of the tree is textured the same as the outside, but we can actually just rescue our wood material and do the exact same thing. Drag that in. Keep in mind that we have a selection tag that is doing the outside faces, so we'll grab the original skin, drag it second, limit it to the selection tag of the outside faces. And now you see the inside is going to be colored by the same wood that we had been feeding it. So now we've got this trunk shattering into a very similar setup, exploding into all these separate pieces, moving away. That's working excellently. Now, we didn't want to run the dynamics on the entire tree. Obviously, subdividing and fracturing all these leaves and these branches, that's crazy. We don't need to go that nuts with it. But we do want these leaves and everything to travel with the tree. And hit save, and let's see if we can make those move with the tree. Here's my thought. Let's create a null. And what do I want this null to do? Well, I'm going to want it to snap somewhere to the trunk. So let's hide the rest of the leaves and the branches, zoom out and take a look at our overall tree. Now, things get a little bit interesting here. Let's name the null snap. Right click on it and add a rigging constraint tag. How do we want to constrain it? Well, I want to constrain by clamping. Let's clamp it. What are we going to clamp to? Well, I want to clamp to the surface. The surface of what? The Voronoi Fracture. Now, by default, it's going to do a big distance, which is like, how far is it where I currently am to where I want to be? Immediately drag that down to 0. And without changing anything else, try moving this null around. I'm on the move tool. If I try and move it, you can see I can scoot this null around a little bit, but it's stuck right here. Why is it stuck there? Well, what I think is happening is this clamp is attempting to link to index 0, the first object inside of the Voronoi Fracture. If we made it editable, it's trying to link to the top object. And so this just happens to be the object that's the first one, and we're stuck to it. But I don't want to be stuck to that one. I want to be stuck to a different object. And we're going to use something I had never used before. Inside of the fracture object, there is a tab called sorting. And this is the index order of all of the different chunks, all the different fractured pieces. So if we turn on sort result and then set the sort result by, I'm going to say I want to sort the result by Y. That should make the top chunk, the first one calculated, it gets the first index. So if I go to snap again, you're going to see it's jumped up to the top. And if I try and move it, it can wheel around on the topmost chunk. Actually, that's pretty good. Now we need to lock this into its current position. So click on the constraint tag. And what do I want this to be? I want it to be constrained as, I think, let's say as a normal. So it should lock onto the normal that it was closest to. I want to use the normals. I want to lock the position. And that should be pretty good. Let's try hitting play and see if it stays stuck. Hit play, the cannonball hits, it shatters, and it is stuck, but you see it's lagging 1 frame behind, which is not unusual with this type of thing. So we can let this keep falling. Just make sure that that is indeed working. And yeah, that's working all the way through there. Let's rewind. How do we make that not, and you see it's even there, it's stuck 1 frame behind. Rewind all the way, maybe twice to make it refresh. Under the constraint tag, under basic, we can change the priority. Currently it's expression, but I want that to be on generators. And I know for a fact that dynamics calculates at generators 400. So I want this to calculate at 401. This will calculate right after all the dynamics are calculated. So if I hit play, hopefully we'll see this perfectly stuck now to the end of this trunk all the way up at the top. That one is stable. Rewinding all the way, you see it refresh properly instantly. All we have to do is unhide our leaves and the rest of the branches, make it a child of the snap, and hopefully, now we're way zoomed out, but here's the most basic version of running the dynamics here. And then as it hits the tree, all these branches are going to move where the rest of the tree went. Now, I'm not going to go into trying to dynamically rig this entire tree. That's an entire giant unrelated thing that we are not going to be addressing. But the ability to easily connect something to part of these dynamic objects is pretty cool. I like that being linked up there. I'm actually quite pleased with that overall. I think this should wrap this one up. Just take one last look at this one crashing through. I mean, it's just the way this translated from one object to the other. I'm just so happy that that did that. That's going to wrap this one up. Thank you so much for watching. As I said earlier, if you're going to use this technique, make sure you make it your own. If you're trying to get some sort of job, employers recognize tutorials and they get really annoyed when they see the same thing over and over again. So do yourself a favor and make it unique. Make it your own. Very, very important. Now, if you found this helpful, if you use it for a project, if it was helpful for some client work or something, I have a Patreon set up. If you would like to support, it is deeply appreciated, but not necessary. These tutorials are free and open to everyone, as well as the Wednesday live stream. Now, as I said, if you are supporting on Patreon, you can get access to the scene files as well as bonus streams currently every Tuesday and Thursday. And even today, I wasn't sure I was going to record, and it was a suggestion from somebody that this is what we should tackle. So there's I really rely on the people supporting and the people coming and hanging out for the directions and inspiration and even helping figure out different things. So it's really, really appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next live stream or the next tutorial. Bye-bye, everybody. everybody. Blah, blah, blah. Hello. Hello. Hello.